is Glenn Lowry, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's press preview for Richard Serra's sculpture, 40 Years. Richard Serra's sculpture, 40 Years, ranges from Richard's early adventures in non-traditional materials to his recent large-scale works in steel, which expand his approach to space and time and create dialogues among viewers, sculpture, and sight.
This room is primarily an H. If you have an H, you have a central leg and two long flanking legs. And I wanted to build three different spatial configurations that would have three completely different spatial experiences. And each piece does that. The piece in the center of the small leg is two torqued toruses. And one flowers out and the other one is inverted almost like a volcano when you walk in. But they're exactly the same. And what a torqued torus is, if you think of the inside of a bicycle rim. If you think of the outside of the rim where the tube goes, it's concave. If you walk inside the bicycle rim, think of a being very large bicycle rim, as large as these pieces are, that side is convex. Now if you take that bicycle rim that you've walked into, that's 13 feet high, and you take the top edge and you rotate it at a 90-degree angle to the bottom edge, that's what this piece is. So it's a torqued torus inverted, and then one turned upside down. And that's the centerpiece. The piece at the end of the room is called Band, and it unfolds in a very continuous logical rhythm, and it has four different concavities. Nothing in the piece ever repeats. That means no surface is ever the same as any other surface. So there's a certain unpredictability to your walking into and through and around it. So as you're walking, nothing ever reoccurs again. And as you go into one volume, you're in the inside of one volume, but you're on the outside of the volume that you've just walked into. And as you walk into the next volume, you're on the inside of the outside of the inside of the last volume. And there's a certain contradiction about what is actually the inside and what's the outside. Because if you're on the inside of one concavity, you're on the outside of the other concavity. So you're either in or out, and the continuous unflowing of the piece it becomes somewhat disconcerting for a lot of people because you lose track of where you're going and where you've been. The piece on the end here is two elliptical spirals that are connected by an interior serpentine passage. It's about 13 feet high, it's 40 feet wide and 70 feet long. And the serpentine passage is constructed so that as you walk it, you actually lose your sense of directionality. So there's a certain kind of interior complexity to the piece, other than being two internal volumes. And that becomes a lot to do with what all these pieces are involved in, and that's walking through space in relation to time and bodily movement, and the unpredictability of you moving through that space. When you walk them, you become the subject of your own experience, meaning that in other works of art, say something on a pedestal or something in a frame, there the content is the depiction or the referential or the representation of what you're looking at. Here the content is your experience walking in and to and around. So you become the content of your own willingness to engage and discover what these works are. The works don't define anything other than your experience. Several years ago I had done a show at the Dia Foundation, and I had known Kirk Barnadoe for years. I knew him when he was a graduate student at Stanford, and I knew him from San Francisco, where we both came from the West Coast for a while. And he asked me after the Dia installation of the torqued ellipses whether I would consider doing a show here at the Museum of Modern Art. And I said, sure, Kirk, I'd love to do it. He said, we're going to build a new building. I said, look, I'm going to need a particular weight load, and I need access. And he said, I am going to write it into the brief of the architectural competition that this floor will be built. And he asked me what kind of weight load I needed, and today we've been able to bring in 550 tons. When Kirk passed away, Lowry had to make the decision on whether or not he was going to continue with the construction of this museum as Kirk had anticipated and actually build this floor to support my work. And Lowry, to his credit, stepped up to the plate and did that. What happened is that I was building a splash piece for Jasper Johns. Johns had seen the piece at the Whitney Annual, and he asked me if I would build a splash piece in his studio. And I went over there with fill glass, and we were heating up lead, and I happened to take a piece of lead that I had that was about 2.5 feet high, maybe 5 or 6 feet long, and I just threw it into the corner, pushed it into the corner, and I wanted to get it out of the way. And I noticed that the juncture of the corner, where the right angle comes together of the corner, I put the plate there, and I noticed that the plate was freestanding, that in effect the walls were holding the piece in place. So then I decided immediately to take a large plate, say 12 by 24, and just put it into a corner and let it define the space of the room. That got me away from making objects, and it got me into the idea of an installation. And so the first piece was called Strike. It's owned by the Guggenheim now. And that took me out of so-called object making and into a bigger concern of the room. How do we define a room? How do we do an installation? And once that happened, I had to get riggers. The very next piece I did was 4 plates out of 4 corners for Documenta. There's a smaller version of that piece upstairs called Circuit 2, and that took me into all kinds of installations, both inside and outside, which either define or declare spaces in terms of the continuity of the whole. But that was the shift. At one point, I built a piece downtown in the Rotary called Rotary Arc, and I hadn't built a curve before. And the reason I wanted to build a curve is that if you stand in relation to the concavity of a curve, you understand it all. It's like a big open breath. If you walk around to the convexity of a curve, it only unfolds in time. And I realized that I didn't know anything about it. I knew nothing about the perception of a curve. And as far as I could tell, other than maybe Frank Lloyd Wright in the city, neither did anyone else. So I thought, I'm going to take this on and really get involved with what it means to make a curve in space. Well, work doesn't develop like linearly in a straight line. It kind of develops in fits and starts. What happens is you work on a series of problems, and those problems lead to solutions. But often those solutions lead to different ideas. I was living downtown, I had no money, so I was just dragging in material off the street and casting it. And then a rubber warehouse emptied out, and I took in a couple of tons of rubber, laid it out on the floor. And the Pollock painting always interested me, and I cut some strips and tried to do that same Iowa painting that Pollock had done, which is probably a serial progression of figures. I just tried to do it as belts hanging on the wall. But that period lasts for about 1 or 2 years. There isn't any big paradigm shift. What happens is work comes out of work. And if the paradigm shift occurs, it's because one problem leads to a different solution that you could not have anticipated. If I look back at the early work now, when I first started to work, just in order to involve myself in working, I wrote down a list of verbs for procedures in relation to material. We moved into the tectonics of building, namely, what does it mean to build something that doesn't have a fixed joint? What does it mean to balance something? What does it mean to counterbalance something? And one of the first things that I did is I took a sheet of rubber that's upstairs, and I lifted it up, and the piece is called To Lift, and it just simply stands there and has a topological inside and outside as a continuous form. If you look at these steel forms here, it has a continuous inside and outside. So even though I would not have made those connections between works that I did 40 years ago and works that are here now, and even though the work isn't linear in that way, I can see connections. One of the things about doing a retrospective is it cuts 2 ways. Certainly, I like to bring all this work together and I like to see it, but in some sense, no one likes to look over their shoulder with some nostalgia and say, oh, that's my past. What you want to do is keep what's in front of you going. And what has really been gratifying to me is to be able to work in this space and build 3 new pieces that I've never built before that are particularly new for me in relation to this building.
In the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Sculpture Garden are 2 works, both owned by the museum. Torqued Ellipse 4 and Intersection 2, which we have never been able to show before, and we're thrilled that they're here now.
I've always believed that material, matter in and of itself, imposes its own form on form, and I'm just getting to the point in my life where, because of the recent technologies and my ability to deal with steel, that I can make things that I could not have foreseen in the past. ship them, they're right across the ocean, the water runs on them. Sometimes if they're still scarred, we spray water on them to take the scarring off. There was a lot of movement in through here, there were a lot of scuff marks, so we had to spray them down a couple of times, but that's it. Basically, Corten steel is a all-proof weathering steel, which means after 8 or 10 years, it turns a dark, dark amber color, holds its skin, and then it ceases to oxidize. And once that happens, like this. Not quite that black, but if you look at Seagram's building, that's the color it'll turn. And that's the nature of Corten steel. Phil Glass was in here yesterday, and I walked him through, and he said, oh, it's just like the structure of music, only the orchestral rhythm takes off on top. Well, in some sense, and then, I had an Islamic scholar here who read it as, coming out of Islam. But people bring their own baggage to it and their own references to it.
How do you see your future work at this point of your career?
Work comes out of work. I don't anticipate work to come. I just want to work. I mean, basically, I'm building a piece for the Grand Palais next year in Paris. I'm trying to do a piece for the Picasso Garden at the Picasso Museum. I'm building a piece in the middle of the country here. I have a commission in Spain. So you just go on working.
One of the things that happened is after Kirk moved on, we were going to do the show together. Dia Foundation, and I think as Glenn mentioned, the Museum of Modern Art. But then the Dia Foundation, they folded their tent, and I thought, oh, what's going to go on now? Then Glenn, and thanks a lot, Glenn stepped right up to the plate and said, okay, we'll do Dia's part. We'll give you the 6th floor, and we can try to put as many of the earlier pieces as we can on the 6th floor. So the show ends up having 27 pieces in it. It's not that it's some linear readout of my work, because a lot of my work, and it's in the catalog and Lynn wrote very beautifully on it, has to do with urban sites and landscape. But if it hadn't been for Glenn picking up the ball here, the work on the 6th floor wouldn't be here. And I don't think you'd be able to tie together where I came from and how this work came about.